Lupus LA would like to thank our generous sponsors for their support of the Your Story, Our Fight podcast. Gemini Beauty believes in beauty for a cause, and in their case, the cause is lupus. The team at Gemini is changing the skincare game for good. We thank GSK for their focus on autoimmune disease and their continued support of Lupus LA. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lupus LA podcast, Your Story, Our Fight. I'm your host, Adam Selkowitz, and thank you to GSK and Gemini Beauty for allowing us to tell these incredible lupus stories. Today, we are talking to Olivia Abousaid, and Olivia is a grief and transformational coach. And I think what's really interesting is how you got into that line of work and how that relates to your lupus. You also have discoid lupus and SLE. Which is not something we see often. And, we haven't talked a lot about discoid lupus on this podcast, so I'd love to get a little bit more into that world. So welcome to the podcast, Olivia.
Thank you, Adam, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So tell me, how old were you when you first started noticing your symptoms?
That's such a tough one because in a sense, my entire life, I always got sick at the drop of a hat. I always got sick really easily and stayed sick longer than your average person. And it almost became a joke in my family how if anybody's going to get sick, it's me. But really, it was a few years ago in my mid 30s, I think, when I really started to experience like the extreme fatigue and started to get, the plaques on my face, for lack of a better word, and itchy skin. And that's when I started going to dermatologists. And then I also was going to an endocrinologist because I also have hypothyroidism. And so I thought maybe my thyroids were acting up. And she'd check my thyroids every 6 months. We'd do blood work. They were fine, and she'd send me on my way. And so I wasn't getting answers for years.
Mm-hmm. And you were, at this point in your life, you're in the film business, correct?
Correct.
So tell me a little bit about what your typical day was like at that time.
At that time, I was working for a company that manufactured cameras and lights for the film industry. And I was working in sales, and it was a really high pressure job. And there were a lot of office politics. So I won't mention the name of the company here. But there were a lot of office politics, and it was just a very high pressure situation. I don't know for sure, but I think that's really what set what was possibly lupus I've had my whole life. I think that's what made it finally active, was that extreme stress that I was under.
So going back, do you think when you were a kid, you had sort of this smoldering fire going on and then the stress sort of threw gasoline on it?
I think so. It's been hard for the doctors to answer that question, but that's sort of my theory on it. I've always had joint pain and bad knees. And, when I was young, we thought it was arthritis or something, and the doctor would refer to it as rheumatism, but I don't think we did any tests beyond that. So,
right.
It's just possible I've always had it, but we don't know.
Sounds like they treated it almost like as a passing thing and not we have to start focusing on or drilling down too much
right.
when you were a kid. Yeah.
It was the 80s, so I don't know if they recognized the importance of it at the time. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And so was the discoid lupus or the SLE the first piece of the puzzle that got diagnosed?
It was the discoid lupus. I had been to a round of dermatologists saying, my skin is itching. I've got these plaques on my face. I had been prescribed, I think, every ointment and lotion that exists out there, lots of high steroid creams, and none of them were working. So I went to this new dermatologist who said, okay, well, if you've tried all of these really high powered creams and they haven't done anything, we might be dealing with lupus here. The only way to know is to do a biopsy. So we did one right there in the office. And I think it was a few days later, it came back positive for lupus. So that's when I got referred to a rheumatologist then.
Okay. And so what are the various treatments for the discoid portion of lupus?
They did prescribe me another cream to take, or to put on my skin. At that point, I was so tired of trying different creams and ointments. I just sort of decided to go without, and I'm still not using it. I'm just using concealer, and it works sometimes. I still get some flakiness sometimes here and there on my skin. And I also really try to watch it when it comes to sun exposure. That does make me feel like a little bit of a vampire sometimes, like, avoiding the sun like it's evil. But yeah, I do notice a difference in my skin when I take care of that sun exposure. When I do get sun, my skin starts to get itchy again.
And is the malar rash, is that do you get that rash as well because you have both discoid and SLE, or you haven't noticed that? It's more.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I don't get that butterfly rash that some people get. It's just been these sort of small plaques on my face.
And so after you get the discoid diagnosis, do you then do a deeper dive with the rheumatologist and the SLE diagnosis comes quickly, or was it down the road?
It took a few weeks after that, but I did start to get answers all kind of in that same time period. We did a round of blood tests, and I think the first was the ANA, and that came up positive, or it came up with a certain number. And then that told us, let's do some more blood tests. So we did those, and then it became really conclusive that I had the SLE.
And so after you start getting treated, how much change was apparent? How did you feel? How did you feel emotionally when you first got diagnosed? And then how did the physical, tackling this thing that you've in some form had your whole life potentially, what did that feel like? Was it relief, more stress, more concern?
I would say all of the above. It was a relief to finally know what I was working with. And because we didn't know what was going on with my face, I think cancer was on the table as a possible choice as well. So it was a relief in a sense to finally get some answers, to know what I was working with, and to start to do the research on what lupus is and what I can do for myself. But, I got diagnosed within that first year of being in lockdown, in the middle of a global pandemic. So in that sense, it was really stressful because I didn't know just how immunocompromised I was, or how easy it would be to get lupus or to get COVID. I did find out the year after that it's quite easy for me to get to get COVID,
Right.
even when you're double masked outdoors. So
that
in
had
that
to add
sense,
a particular layer of stress. You're getting, I hadn't thought about that, but you're getting diagnosed with an autoimmune disease as the messaging to the world is, if you have an autoimmune disease, lock yourself in your basement.
right.
And so that had to add, because I had a huge burst of stress and anxiety at the beginning of COVID, especially since I have lung involvement. It was like, the news was basically talking directly to me,
Right.
saying, do not get COVID.
Exactly.
But so that really probably, were you feeling very isolated at that point? I mean, not just physically isolated, but not being able to kind of share this diagnosis with friends and family, et cetera.
Yeah, it was definitely isolating, and to an extent, it still feels a little isolating. But, right now the whole world has kind of gone back to operating as normal. So it feels right now that the burden of COVID and the pandemic that is still around us is on those of us who are immunocompromised. So I'm still masking in indoor situations or crowded situations when I fly. So that, it does feel a little isolating when you feel like you're the odd one out in a situation like that. And when I first got diagnosed, I slowly started to tell close family and friends, because I felt like this is something I need to share. I need somewhat of a support system going on for me.
Mm-hmm. I know you joined some of our support groups early on. Was that during COVID?
It was. And they were really great. Lupus LA was one of the first resources that I found. And it's been invaluable. I was going to the support groups for a while with Jasmine, and she was great about moderating and letting us sort of speak. And I also didn't know anybody who had lupus. I still don't really know anyone personally who has lupus. So
well, now you do.
Now
there we
I
go.
do.
Right.
So it was great to meet people who are going through it and know what it's like.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that you found that, especially being isolated in COVID. I think that's, we were able to switch those support groups to virtual support groups fairly quickly in the process. And it was amazing to me how many people came out of the woodwork saying, I need, because I think pre-COVID, you can kind of not mask the disease, but you can kind of let your life block the emotion that you feel. And when you're locked down, there's not much, it's all right there and pretty raw. So I can imagine that was pretty terrifying. Yeah. Let me do this. I want to take a quick break, and then I want to come back and talk about how you transitioned out of the film industry and into this grief and transformational coaching, and what that's all about. So we're going to take a break. We'll be right back after this.
Lupus LA's fellowship program is an essential part of ensuring the training of future rheumatologists. The nation is experiencing a serious shortage of pediatric rheumatologists. Today, there are approximately 300,000 children diagnosed with rheumatic conditions in the United States, but only about 250 practicing pediatric rheumatologists to meet this tremendous need.
We are back on the Lupus LA podcast, Your Story, Our Fight. And today's story is from Olivia Abousaid. And we're talking before the break about this this isolation you felt. So tell me a little bit about sort of this big shift in career from sales to grief and transformational coaching, and where that came from and what it was like, and we'll start there.
Sure. I started to build my coaching business sort of on the side while I was doing sales. Of course, as someone with lupus, it was pretty exhausting trying to build a business at the same time. And then two things sort of happened for me. I was questioning, for the first time in my life, do I not want to be in the film business anymore? And that was a really big question for me career-wise, because it was all I had ever wanted to do. And the way I was able to do sales is by helping people. That's the way I looked at it. I'm helping people get things that they want. And so when I started to think about coaching, it just seemed so natural to approach that as a career, because I'm empathetic, and I like listening to people and helping people, and it seemed more in line with what I want to do. The film industry has also been hit very hard these past few years, so it was kind of a natural evolution to head in that way anyway.
And why transformational in grief as opposed to career coaching or sales coaching, or where did the mission part of it come from?
It came from just the grief that I've experienced. both growing up and as an adult, and getting diagnosed with lupus was one of those sort of seminal moments where I felt some grief and continued to work on my grief through my limitations, because you kind of don't get to do everything you want to do when you're so exhausted all the time. So there is some grief associated with that. There was grief growing up in terms of a lot of racism I experienced as a Palestinian. And there's still a lot of that now, unfortunately. There's a lot of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab grief going, or racism going on, and then different losses that I've had in my life. And so I really started to lean towards grief. And then I realized there's another part of this. There's another side to the coin, and that, grief, it's important to address it and honor it and take the time with it. But it's also important to know that you can use it as a catalyst for transformation, that you still have agency. We're never totally broken as individuals, that we can still change our lives. We can take action. We can be empowered within that grief, still experience the grief, but we can grieve in certain ways where we don't feel so helpless all the time. And that part of it is really important to me to pass on to potential clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, because if you can own your grief and be able to kind of get control of it, what is that next step? And how do you not get past it, but use it to grow and to make change in your life, that you're not going to get sucked back in or stuck in that grief. And so tell me a little bit about how you would go about coaching a lupus patient who is newly diagnosed, and sort of what have you seen in the people that you've talked to that may be somewhat universal amongst lupus patients?
I think with both lupus patients and anybody who's sort of dealing with an autoimmune or chronic condition, like I was mentioning, there can be a lot of grief over what are my limitations, what can I do and not do. And it's important to take time with that and not rush people through that process. I think when someone is, especially in the initial stages of grieving, it's important to allow people that time to really address their grief and recognize that there is grief. I think with so many things in life, we're used to sort of glazing over them, not on purpose, but we're just so busy doing things. We're busy with the myriad amount of things that we have to do in our lives. And so it's teaching people to make that time and that space to do that grieving work. And then from there, you address, well, what can I do to feel empowered? Okay, I do have limitations, yes, but here are some of the things I can do. There is some, I'm not a therapist, but there is some cognitive behavioralism that comes in there with what we do as coaches. And that's kind of really important in sort of changing people's thinking to know that they're not stuck in one place their entire lives.
Mm-hmm. And so as you go through the process in your life to get your certificates, to train, how did that help you manage your lupus diagnosis?
It was kind of interesting because you go to a place where you start questioning everything about your thinking, and it becomes a lot at once. I got my certification, and then I went back and got my master's certification for the coaching. And you really start to question, well, I've been thinking this way and I've been doing things this way. And so you do, in a sense, coach yourself, and you work with other coaches. You do a lot of practice initially. And even from time to time, you still practice with other coaches just to try different modalities and things like that. And so it's important to constantly keep learning and coaching yourself and practicing what you preach. and coaches are not perfect people, neither are therapists or counselors. They experience
Right.
human emotions and things like everybody else, but it's just as important for us, if not a little more important, to do the work so that we can be there for our clients.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the lupus diagnosis helped you transform, or did you transform because you got this lupus diagnosis and then that made you really feel like, okay, I need a total shift in lifestyle and then on top of that, because I think I know the answer to that, what's the success rate? I mean, how have you felt like your health has improved or your feelings of grief have improved?
There's a certain, I still butt my head from time to time against my limitations in that when it comes to my exhaustion, which is normal. One thing I've learned about grief is that it can be ongoing, and that's okay. There's no point at which you just stop grieving and move on. Grief can be ongoing, and that's fine. For me, getting the diagnosis did shift a lot of things for me, and then learning about the coaching and mental health and things like that shifted even more, I'd say, in a positive direction. In that there's some more acceptance now. Like, okay, I have these limitations, but there's no need to totally dwell on them all the time either. Those first few years, that feeling like, I'm a vampire now, I can't go out in the sun. Well, I can a little with some modifications. I can wear a hat or a UV umbrella or, slather on the sunscreen. I just have to take some more steps than other people and try to walk in the shade when I can and things like that.
Right.
So,
Right.
we're not always so stuck in place. And that was something that really was a shift for me.
Mm-hmm. Do you miss the sales film job, industry, or has this sort of really become your mission?
I still have a great love for cinema. I still love watching movies. I like watching old movies as well. And just, you can kind of see the history of cinema. I love all of that still. I don't miss sales. In anything we kind of do in life, there's a little bit of sales involved.
Mm-hmm.
I
Right.
think we're all sort of products these days in a way. We're all our own brand, but I don't miss the sales aspect of it as much. I'm really enjoying just getting to work with people one-on-one mainly. Eventually I'll be doing some group coaching as well, but I really enjoy that one-on-one and giving people the space and the time. And one thing I've really realized since starting coaching is that a lot of people don't get that much time where people just listen to them and let them talk and let them get things out. And I think coaching can be really powerful in that sense.
And what have you learned from your clients? I mean, what have your clients given to you in your journey?
It's made me realize that I don't have to feel so alone. There are different things in life that can make you feel really isolated and alone. And one thing I'm realizing in talking to my clients is that can be kind of a universal feeling. And there are certain experiences and certain feelings that we all have that are kind of universal. And so I'm realizing and seeing what they're struggling with is that we all kind of struggle with similar things, and that, it's sad to see people struggling with things, but at the same time, that we're not as alone as we feel we are. We're not as isolated as we feel we are. And it was the same with lupus, and that's why I was so grateful to Lupus LA, and that there is support there. Just take a little initiative and look. But I found Lupus LA pretty quickly, and it was great to find that support and the learning and that empowerment that, there's still plenty that we can do as people with lupus.
What's your takeaway or your advice to somebody who's in their grief, currently in their grief, either newly diagnosed or just cannot seem to transform their lupus diagnosis into something more positive than negative? Not that a lupus diagnosis is positive, but what's your advice to somebody who's really in that middle of that grief phase?
That it's okay to not have to look for the positive initially. I think there's a lot of pressure on us as a society to always find the silver lining, always look at the bright side, always try to be positive. But when you're in those initial stages of grief and really dealing with that trauma of whatever it is, whether it's a lupus diagnosis or anything else, let yourself just be sad for a while. Let yourself be depressed for a while. Let yourself feel that grief. It's okay to be sad. And I think we don't hear that enough in society. It really is okay to just be sad for a while. And another thing that I really emphasize to a lot of clients is find your community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, for me, that was these support groups through Lupus LA. Again, I didn't know anybody with lupus, and so it was invaluable to me to meet other people in that way who were going through something similar, who can understand what I'm going through. They get the fatigue that I'm experiencing. When you talk to people who don't have a chronic illness or an autoimmune condition, you say, I'm tired, and they say, oh yeah, I didn't sleep last night either. I'm tired too. And it's a different kind of fatigue, you know?
Yes, 100%.
And so it's nice to find community and people who understand. So I tell people when they're ready, please find your community, because it can help lift you out of those initial stages of grief. It really does help.
Well, we are extremely excited to have you as a member of our community. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's incredibly valuable advice. And I think what you're doing is really admirable and needed. I think it's really something that you've really taken your lupus diagnosis and turned it into something really positive and really helpful. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us today and for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it so much as well.
On behalf of the entire team at Lupus LA, we thank you for joining the Your Story, Our Fight podcast. Please tune in, spread the word, and come back for more inspiring lupus stories. I'm your host, Adam Selkowitz, wishing you good health, and to always remember, your story is our fight.